Hey guys, project-zodiac here. This is my second part of my X-Men film explanation series. Um, if you haven't seen the first part, please do so. It's where I talk about the X-Men film timeline and where I give specific dates for specific events, specific character births as well, and specific timeline placements where there wasn't before, such as for X-Men 1 and 2, and it's not where people think it is. I had to do a lot of math for not just the timeline itself, but for character births as well, and it was just a lot of hard work to make sure that the timeline was as accurate as it could be. So please go check that out. I will be touching on some of the things I quickly commented on that on this video. I'm gonna be going really fast through my notes just because there's around 40 things to go through and it's just a lot of notes. So we're gonna be starting off with characters, and the very first one is Professor Xavier. But before we go on to that, I just want to introduce this video where we're going to be explaining the retcons, continuity errors, and contradictions between each of the movies. And basically, all 40 something of these, they're not retcons or continuity errors or inconsistencies if you watch the movies. As the movies go on, yes, there are explanations for everything. So it does show that, okay, I guess Fox saw this and was going to be explaining it. A lot of it at the time seemed like it wasn't an inconsistency, but as we watch the movies that we have now with the series ending, we have so many answers to so many things that we thought were retcons. So I wanted to take the time and talk about the characters first before we move on into the world. Before I start, I do have to really state a disclaimer that all of these videos will have spoilers for every single X-Men movie, every single one of them, including Dark Phoenix. So the very first character we're going to be talking about is Professor Xavier. In X-Men 1, Professor Xavier tells Wolverine that he met Magneto when he was 17 years old. But when we see them meeting each other for the first time in X-Men First Class, we see that they're not 17-year-olds, they're 30-year-olds. So lots of people started saying, oh, they screwed up, clearly because X-Men First Class was released after X-Men 1. So, people started saying Fox didn't care. Here's the answer to that, though. We already know, due to Logan, that Professor Xavier is a 97-year-old guy in 2029. And he also has seizures and tends to mix things up or completely forget some things for a few moments. For example, in Logan, Professor Xavier thought that Wolverine was married to Jean, but it was actually Scott who's married to Jean. And we also see that throughout all of Logan, him just mixing things up. And Professor Xavier even says it, that he does mix a couple things up. So him telling Wolverine that he met Magneto when he was 17 years old during the events of X-Men 1 could be the early stages of his whatever he has, his mental thing, whatever he has. Because Logan's set in 2029 and X-Men 1 is set in 1994. So if Professor Xavier is 97 years old in Logan, he's around 65 at the time of X-Men 1. Around that time, we can basically just assume that there's starting to be some early signs of what will happen eventually. And this does make sense in a real case scenario as well. So that is one of the best explanations for why he tells Wolverine that he met Magneto when he was 17. Because in 1994, or maybe slightly before then, his mind started to mix things up very rarely, but it was still there. Moving on to the second issue that people have with Professor Xavier is Professor Xavier's resurrection at the end of X-Men 3, The Last Stand, is never really explained. But technically it is. If you see X-Men 3 closely, Professor Xavier has a video call with Moira during a class, and he, talks with her and the class about transferring a consciousness to another body. And at the end of X-Men 3, we see him waking up in another person's body. For what we know, that body could have also been paralyzed, so that's why we see him still in a wheelchair at the end of the Wolverine. And it could be his brother's body from the comics. We know that in the comics, Professor Xavier has a brother. We've never seen that in the movies. He's never mentioned that in the movies. But we can assume he has a twin or a older or younger brother due to Deadpool 2, which we'll talk about that later. Or it could also just be the body of a random paralyzed guy that, you know, by medical terms could have been brain dead by that point. So like it was just his body that was being there, and the doctors are saying that, you know, his consciousness is just gone, but his organism is still living. So it could be that Professor Xavier just decided to transfer his consciousness there right before he got killed by Jean. But this guy was also paralyzed. So he might not actually look like Professor at all, except that when he's talking with people, he projects his face to them, so we see him instead of the guy. The third thing for Professor is in X-Men, the Professor is unsure of how Magneto has been able to block him from reading his mind. But in First Class, we see that, you know, Magneto gets the helmet from Shaw, and Professor Xavier sees this too, and he knows that it's the helmet. This one and the very first one about the Professor's age thing is one of my favorite ones, and it's actually very, very easy to explain. Yeah, Professor Xavier saw Magneto take Shaw's helmet, but that was in 1962. In 1973, Magneto is in the Pentagon without his helmet. So let's assume, you know, in the original timeline, he does get out, which he does, and he gets his helmet back. From that time, whenever it is that he escaped in the original timeline, whenever he escaped from the Pentagon until 1994, where X-Men 1 takes place in, it's still a very long time. Professor Xavier probably ran across Magneto many times during that period, and at one point, maybe something happens to the helmet, which again, Magneto originally took from Shaw. He did not build it. He does not know how it was built either, and neither did Shaw. So Professor assumes now that the helmet, now if something happened to the helmet, that the helmet's gone, so there's no barriers anymore since Magneto didn't know how the helmet was made. But again, Magneto has had this helmet for decades, so he probably did figure out how it was actually made, and he maybe did make a new one without Charles even knowing that he made one, and without Professor Xavier even knowing that he knew how to make one. So that's probably why he tells Wolverine how Magneto seems to have found a way to block him. It's just because he didn't realize that Magneto built his own helmet. Because when Magneto and Professor Xavier see each other again, but like Magneto is in his costume in X-Men 1, after that Wolverine and Charles are all talking with the X-Men, and Professor Xavier says, like, it's his helmet, that's what's blocking me from him. But he also says it in a way that's sort of like something from the past came back. So we can assume, because he was being very thoughtful during that, so we can assume that, yeah, he remembers this helmet, and he figures out that Magneto somehow made a new helmet. So that's basically explaining that retcon and continuity error, or whatever you want to call it. The fourth one is, how is Professor Xavier walking, being bald, and using his powers in the 80s to save Scott and the others? And again, 80s is very loose because that was actually in X-Men Origins Wolverine, and that was set in 1979. So how was he using his powers and was bald and was walking in 1979? Well, since Origins is set in 1979, which is 6 years from 1973, he's basically trying to rebuild his school. He's probably still uses a small amount of the serum to help him fix his legs and still be able to use some amount of his powers. This is sort of what Beast does, because Beast doesn't take a large dose like Professor Xavier used to in 1973. He takes enough just to control his appearance. So we can probably assume that Professor Xavier is taking enough just to get his legs walking so that he can, go to these places a lot easier than if he had to be in his wheelchair. But it also still allows him to have at least some of his abilities, because we see that when he takes too much, he doesn't have any of his abilities. But it could be that, which I think is the most likely case, or it could just be him projecting himself down to them so that they could go up into the jet, but he's not physically there at the bottom of the steps waiting for them. That is just like an astral projection for them. And again, whatever caused him to lose his hair in the original timeline must have happened between 1973 and 1979. Now, another one is that Professor says that Magneto helped him build Cerebro in X-Men 1 or 2. I forgot which one. But we do see that it's Beast who built it. So that's another error. But it's not. See, Beast made the prototype. And Professor Xavier does tell Logan that Magneto did help him make it, but he means the one in the mansion. So at some point before Magneto gets sent to the Pentagon, he probably helped Professor and Beast both make the Cerebro inside the X-Mansion, or at some point after he got out of the Pentagon in the original timeline, something destroys the mansion and he helps rebuild it, similar to how he does at the end of X-Men Apocalypse. And because remember, Beast did say in Days of Future Past that if you change something by going back in time, some things might be changed completely, but some things could still happen, just slightly altered or completely altered. So something must have happened for Magneto to come and help rebuild Cerebro, or he helped them before 19 whenever he got sent to jail. Sorry, I can't remember right now. Before he got sent to the Pentagon. The sixth one is that Professor Xavier never tells anyone that Mystique is related to him in any way in the original 3 films. But he never said anything about a brother either. And we can assume that he actually does one because of the movies. Also, he didn't really need to say anything about her. He only said something about her in 2023 to explain the situation. So it's not something that, he's going to be telling people like, oh yeah, see that blue lady? Yeah, she's my adopted sister. And now she's trying to kill me. Professor Xavier isn't that kind of person. He lets people try to figure things out by themselves. And yes, even though we never really got that much interaction between them, the audience could still see from X-Men 1 that Mystique does know her way around the mansion. And lots of people thought, oh, how did she do that? Maybe Magneto telling her how? Probably, yeah. But also because she grew up there. Now, the last one for Professor Xavier, which is the 7th one for Professor Xavier, is, does Professor Xavier actually have a brother? And in the new timeline, is it the Juggernaut? Because in the old timeline, we see the Juggernaut, and he's a totally different Juggernaut than the one in the new timeline. And in the new timeline, that Juggernaut in Deadpool 2 tells Russell that he wears that helmet to stop his brother from reading his mind, and that his brother is in a wheelchair. So we can maybe assume that it is Professor Xavier. That, and with what happens at the end of X-Men 3 for Professor Xavier to awake again, does lead to signs that yes, he does actually have a brother in the X-Men ones. It's either a twin or a slightly younger or a slightly older brother. Again, he never really needed to mention it, but it's just part of their lives in the film universe. How come Professor Xavier is headmaster in 2023, but he retires in 1992 and Beast becomes the headmaster? Well, he returns to be headmaster after some time in Genosha with Magneto, or maybe he doesn't even go to Genosha, but he goes wherever he wants to go. But he's probably influenced to return after talking with Magneto after some time, and also with like Beast and the rest of the X-Men as well. And maybe even by the time Jean comes back, he's already the headmaster again. And we can assume that he is the headmaster in 2023 and not Beast, because he asks Logan in a very like authority kind of way, asking him like, shouldn't you be teaching your history class right now? And Logan is like, history, I don't know what you're talking about. And Professor Xavier is like, oh, welcome back. So we can sort of assume he does go back to being the headmaster of the school. So that's it for Professor Xavier. Let's go on to the next characters. So now we're talking about Wolverine, Logan, whatever you want to call him, because he has a lot of names, and that's going to be one of these as well. So the very first one is, in Origins, Wolverine and Sabretooth are both part of the Vietnam War, but they shows Logan in the US. Again, if you saw my timeline video, which would be part 1, you would see that that isn't an issue, because the Vietnam War was from 1955 to 1975. The past events of Days of Future Past takes place in 1973, and Origins takes place in 1973 and 1979. So we can assume that in the original timeline, Logan went back to the Vietnam War after Mystique kills Trask. Again, I quickly touched on this during my timeline video. So whatever events that show Logan and Sabretooth in Origins during the Vietnam War most likely happened either right before Wolverine goes back to the US for some short amount of time, or right after. And right after, because that's when Trask meets them, soon after Wolverine goes back to the war. So the second one is, Wolverine is getting, his metal claws popped out in Days of Future Past. But how does he get his metal claws if in the Wolverine he gets his bone claws back? So this was a little bit of a lazy issue that the writers did. They could have easily just explained it rather than just letting us assume it for ourselves. But in the Wolverine, he had only his adamantium claws cut out, not the entire adamantium from his body extracted. So he still has adamantium in his body. It's just in his claws that he doesn't. What most likely did happen is because in Days of Future Past, Magneto is with them. So Magneto just maybe dropped down, like extended, stretched out the metal from his forearm into his claws. He could have easily just done that. So, and that's how he got his metal claws back. So the third one's about Logan's name. His birth name is James Howlett. He also goes by Jimmy. He also goes by Logan. He also goes by Wolverine. So how did he get all of these names? Well, Jimmy is a nickname for James, which James Howlett is his birth name, given to him by his stepfather and his mother. A few people do call him Jimmy due to his birth name, but Logan himself refers to himself and others as Logan because of his biological father, whose name in the movie is Thomas Logan. Thomas Logan, him and Sabretooth's dad just has a different last name than Sabretooth, because Sabretooth's last name is Creed. So he probably decided to go with the name Logan as his first name, just probably so that he could try to abandon his past, his mother being horrified of him and his stepfather being killed. So he probably just wanted something new and wanted to just start over, and that's probably why he decided to go with the name Logan. And that's why you see all of these different people call him these like 3 or 4 different names. And of course, Wolverine, he got it from his ex-girlfriend. So how is the adamantium bullet possible with Wolverine and X-24? Stryker does say that in X-Men Origins, the only thing that can stop Logan is an adamantium bullet. We see that the metal has already been cooled in Wolverine from when he had the surgery to when he loses his memories. So it's all hardened, and so the adamantium bullet couldn't really do too much damage. All it could do was erase Logan's memories instead of killing him. It blew X-24's head off with a huge hole, probably because they did a different procedure on X-24. Because again, X-24 he was created. He wasn't naturally born. He was genetically and using genetics, sort of like X-23 Lara, but in his case, he was fully created. He was already created as an adult, and Lara was born. So whatever they did to actually create X-24, they probably spent more time doing that, making sure that they got his strength and everything correct. And they probably also focused more on making the metal in his claws the strongest part because they wanted to make a weapon. The metal on the rest of his skeleton is probably just very thin. It is still adamantium, and it is strong enough to deflect just about anything else, but not strong enough to really stop another adamantium thing from completely destroying it. So by adamantium standards, it's probably really, really badly made how they implemented the metal on his skeleton, but not his claws. So that could probably be why his head just blew up the way that it did when Lara shot it with the adamantium bullet. What's up with the difference in Logan's adamantium procedure from X-Men 1 and 2 and in Origins? You know, we could have said that they remodeled it after Wolverine left, but the flashbacks still show the base like that. So we know that he hasn't been back there since 1979. So that can't really be the case. So it's not really them remodeling because that's how it was in Logan's flashbacks. So that one's basically just the production design of the movie, which is kind of stupid, but yeah, sorry for that one. Number 6 for Wolverine is Logan. In Logan still has his dog tags, his katana, and Professor thinks that he was married to Jean, and he even says that he was a cage fighter, and that Logan says that the Statue of Liberty incident happened a long time ago. But in the original timeline, he tosses away his dog tags. He never married Jean. How does any of this make sense? And we know that he doesn't even marry Jean in the new timeline either because she's with Scott at the end of Days of Future Past. Well, Beast still says that things can happen. Again, I bring up Beast because he says this. So even if you change the timeline, some stuff still happens. Logan still went to Nagasaki. He still saved Yashida during World War II. And Logan is set in the new timeline. So he must have gone to Japan. He probably got his sword back, after World War II. He probably went to visit Yashida, or he probably went to just visit Japan, ran across Yashida, got his sword back, and something could have happened in Japan. Maybe the same things as the movie Logan, the movie The Wolverine, or maybe slightly different or totally different. He still has his dog tags because this is the new timeline. He just didn't toss it away. And with Jean and the Statue of Liberty, well, remember when Wolverine wakes up in his new body, in a way, in 2023's new timeline? Well, he goes down and talks with Professor Xavier. He tells Professor Xavier everything about their journey from the original timeline. And Professor Xavier tells Wolverine everything about, Wolverine's life and everything about the X-Men from the new timeline. So Wolverine tells Professor that he had to kill Jean in the original timeline. Because of Professor's mind state in that dinner scene of Logan, he is confusing Wolverine for Scott. And he was right when he said that he killed Jean, but again, This professor only knows this because Wolverine told him his whole life from the original timeline. So that's how that works. And that's the same thing for the Statue of Liberty, because Wolverine, again, told Professor everything, so Professor knows about the events from the Statue of Liberty. And he could also be referring to like maybe something in the Statue of Liberty did happen too, but it's most likely Wolverine's story from the original timeline. The seventh one for Wolverine is, how does Wolverine know Xander Rice's father is who injected him with the adamantium when it was Stryker, and he does not remember things from the new timeline since his consciousness only arrived in 2023? Well, again, when Wolverine's consciousness comes back to his body in the new timeline in 2023, him and Professor shared their stories from the two timelines. Professor Xavier most likely knows what happens with Wolverine, the whole new procedure of the new timeline. So he probably told Wolverine, oh yeah, Stryker was behind all of this, but the person who was injecting the adamantium into you was this guy's name. I forgot his name, which is Xander Rice's father. So that's how Wolverine knows that Xander Rice, who again is Alkali Transigen's boss or manager, whatever he is, he's the guy who started wiping out mutants back in 2004. And he tells Wolverine, like, oh, you killed my dad. And he's like, yeah, he's the guy who put this poison in me, like the adamantium in me. So that's why Logan the movie knows that it wasn't Stryker who put the adamantium in him, but Stryker was still involved in the procedure. Where is Logan in X-Men Dark Phoenix? Well, he's not part of the team in 1992. The team or the professor probably does find him again sometime between 1992 and 2004, as in 2004 is when the mutants start to die out, and by Logan's comments in Logan, the movie, it seems that he was already with the team by the time that 2004 was happening. So that's all for Professor Xavier and Wolverine. I'm going to end the video here just because it is getting really long. So stay tuned for part 3, where we're going to be continuing explaining these retcons and continuities with the characters. Rate, comment, subscribe, and I'll talk to you guys later.